I'm Christian Schiller. Welcome to my podcast, an enthusiastic ramble through whatever has taken my interest the past week or so. Expect technology, games, history, travel, geekery, and as always, much, much more. Welcome everybody. A short roundup of links this week before I get into the interview I had with Josh Koenig of Pantheon, which was quite interesting. I remember Pantheon from my Drupal days, and we spoke a lot about the past, present, and future of content delivery, where they came from, what they have been doing, and what they're about to do with the proliferation of new ways of managing and providing content. So that was an interesting chat. But first, let's have a few links. Now, this is something, it relates nicely to an interview I'll have next week with Jetpack, who have built some tools on top of NixOS. And this is from John Leonard in computing.co.uk. After 20 years, our developers are now ready for Nix. Now, Nix is an operating system, and it's an operating system that lets you sort of recreate as much as possible from configuration files, everything as code. I published a post on Medium a couple of weeks ago relating somewhat to this, where I attempt to do this on macOS, and it sort of works. But NixOS is designed from the ground up, and it's existed for 20 years. But companies like Jetpack and also Phlox are all now attracting funding and interest in doing this on a commercial scale. I think a lot of this relates to the concept of SBOMs, a software bill of materials. You can literally have an SBOM for an operating system. And it's an interesting time. And I think sometimes, like containers were nothing new, and then Docker just popularized it. So there's an aspect where sometimes the technology can exist for a while, but its time comes and then people step in to commercialize it. But NixOS as a concept has been around for a while, and I will be producing some learning live streams or some edited videos. I'm not sure yet, looking at the various things in the ecosystem, I think, because I find it quite an interesting idea, as much as is possible in virtual machines anyway. Next, this was reported quite widely, but I will refer to Danny Palmer on ZDNet. What actually happened to LastPass? I haven't used LastPass for some time, mostly because I started finding the application so damn ugly, and I'm very happy with 1Password. But yes, a lot of other people have been moving away from it recently for other reasons, very justifiable reasons. And they finally revealed, months later, what happened. It was basically a sort of social engineering attack against a senior engineer, and then they gained access into all sorts of things from there. So, as always, it's always everything is strong as its weakest link, and that was their weakest link. But yes, why they took so long to tell people, I think, is everyone's main reservation. I'd be very interested to know the financial hit that has come to LastPass because of this, and the converse upsurge that has come to 1Password and Bitwarden and others because of it too. But I'm not sure if they would release those figures, or maybe Bitwarden and 1Password might, but I don't know about LastPass. Next, of course, it would not be a tech show without a quick mention of ChatGPT. Firstly, this is from Essie Ireland over on Medium. As a technical writer, I am worried about ChatGPT. As a technical writer, I guess I am a little as well. Although I will admit that still ignoring a lot of the procedural stuff and the sort of API reference type documentation that, I think is ripe for disruption thanks to AIs. There's a lot of the other content of how to piece it all together that still needs a human touch, or maybe like many other industries, we're going to be more editors now. I have been experimenting with using some of these tools, especially Copilot, and it does help me. It helps me brainstorm ways of writing paragraphs and things like that. I will admit that, but for generating entire documentation, not quite yet. We'll see, I suppose. But it's definitely that one area of the writing world that is probably more exposed than others. But then we said creative writing wasn't, which leads nicely to my final link for the week, which again was widely reported, but this is referencing Liam Tung again from ZDNet. Sci-Fi Magazine, this is Clark's World, a pretty well-known one, halts new submissions after a surge in AI written stories, and I don't think they were the only ones. So, and also Amazon has been doing a similar thing. It varies whether people are actually crediting ChatGPT or not, but it's people are flooding submission systems with things they have partially written. And I will admit, as someone who's currently trying to submit stories which are somewhat in the science fiction genre to places, it's very hard right now because, everyone's getting flooded with submissions, and it's very hard. It's always been hard for first-time writers to get a look in, and now we're also getting pushed out the way by people using AIs. So great times to be a writer. You, as a creative writer, you have a head start ahead of all these systems, but at the same time, you're being pushed out the way by people using them. So what can you do? I do feel like there's a lot of this discussion around AI and creative process that is not talked about much. It's a very engineering perspective in that creative people sometimes like that process. We like to go through the pain, the work to create worlds and inhabit them and work within them. And then having other people who I don't know if they do or don't appreciate that, just sort of flooding your industry with things written by machines is yeah. I'm not the only one to say this, but it's a little it's affecting in a different way, in a way that these systems are affecting technical writing in a very sort of replacement way, but then affecting creative writing kind of in a spam way. And I think a lot of this people will tire of doing this. It's always the way with spam. When everyone was on Zoom, we had Zoom bombers, and then people got tired with that. So there's always people wanting to ruin the internet for everybody else. But after a while, they get bored and they move on. Now is my interview with Josh Koenig from Pantheon, where we talk about the past, present, and definitely my past and my present and my future, because I'm a very content-heavy person, of managing, delivering content. Enjoy. Today I am joined by Josh Koenig. Depends where you're from. I have learnt to pronounce this umlaut-y, O-E, so just about. And Josh is from Pantheon. I know Pantheon pretty well from the past, but before we get to that, maybe you could explain what Pantheon is now, and we can dig into some more detail from there.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. Great to be here. So Pantheon is, as we describe it, a website operations or web ops platform. And kind of what that means, to unpack it a little bit, is we help our customers apply the proven practices of DevOps to the particularly thorny and sometimes complex use case of running websites at scale. So that means both very large websites that receive a ton of traffic and also large web portfolios where you have lots and lots of individual sites. So we combine the workflows that teams need to iterate on those sites at high velocity with the serverless cloud-based platform that allows them to scale both in terms of traffic and number of instances. And then for our biggest customers, we provide a lot of extra governance value. So they can have their cake and eat it too, where they can let individual groups, teams, departments, product lines, what have you, run with their own instance, but they can kind of have a bird's eye view on everything that's going on and maintain central components in a well-governed way. And all those things combine to let us, support, about 20,000 professional teams on a weekly basis using our platform to manage, hundreds of thousands of sites that are collectively reaching billions of unique visitors a month. Primarily, the platform's built around sites that leverage Drupal or WordPress, open source content management systems. We have deep experience with those. We're also adding support for next generation JavaScript front ends as well, because that's an exciting development in our industry that I think is going to be a big deal for the next 10 years for sure. And we want to help customers that are moving in that direction do so, again, with all those benefits of speed, safety, and governance.
Yeah. And this is where I remember Pantheon in the past. I have a past life in the Drupal world. Some time ago, actually now. So I guess Pantheon's been around for a while. So maybe in relative terms, so maybe we could quickly go into what what was the origin story for the company in the first place?
Sure. Yeah, it's a fun story. So, my co-founders and I, we all sort of came up professionally in the early to mid 2000s, and we had founded our own digital agency. And around at the time Drupal primarily, open web stuff more generally, but kind of built this practice around Drupal. And between like 2006 and 2010, grew the agency up to about 30 people or so, working with larger and larger customers, more and more complex projects, projects where you're having, there's developers on the client side, multiple agencies are being brought in. And while the projects themselves were really different because they had different use cases and different designs and were serving different purposes, we were putting in place kind of the same fundamental workflow and platform for each one in order to be successful with multiple developers, and also to have like a cadence for doing continuous integration and continuous deployment so that we could keep, we could iterate quickly even after the site launched. And then we also are involved in the community, and we started looking around and seeing people who weren't able to put this structure in place would often have projects go off the rails, right? And, people who have been in the business, like we've all been there, right? Like, so you're behind on your timeline, the launch is looming, you bring in another subcontractor to try to speed things up, but it actually slows things down because people are stepping on each other's toes. And so then you're pushing really hard to get the site live for launch, and you do, but then something's wrong, and it's like a fire drill to get it stable or fix it. And then, 2 weeks later, you're finally in a good place for now, but the site build itself is now like the end of a game of Jenga, right? Yeah. And nobody really wants to make the next move, and people are upset. Like, you launch late and have trouble with that. Like, clients may not pay you, and so there's all these kind of negative things that occur when you don't have this like fundamental operations piece in place first. And we were doing this as like pretty pricey enterprise consulting, right? It was not something that could be widely available to the market because you can't pay our team to spend 2 months doing this ahead of you getting like a single web page built. So, but we realized that part of our practice was just getting more and more and more refined, right? The sites were very different, but that operations practice was really dialing in. And we're like, hey, we have an opportunity to do something different here. We can start a new business. We can turn this into a service instead of, services, and run it like a SaaS business. And that's what we set out to do starting in 2010. It took us a while to get onto the market with our, like a real scalable product in 2012. But since then, we've just been growing and growing because there is really this big need for the underlying operational components to be in place for people to get the benefit that they want from a website or a content management system.
So back in the Drupal days, this is obviously a while ago, DevOps and CI/CD and things like that were kind of early visions, and especially with those complex CMS, it was always fraught. And I think companies like Pantheon were the first people to actually try to figure out some practices about how to make that possible. But to be honest with you, a lot of people just still kept doing things somewhat manually and a little bit sort of sellotape and stuff like that. And now, at least in the timeline you just mentioned, more than 10 years later, we now have, proper, very well-defined processes. You're talking about a serverless CMS, kind of almost the other complete end of something like Drupal. So What do you think has been some of the biggest changes in that period to bring you to where you are, but bring also the industry to where it is?
Well, I think that in that time period, when we first started, Amazon Web Services and EC2 was still relatively new. And frankly, at the time that we started, we didn't build on AWS. We built out our first version of our platform and ran for the first 5 years of the company on Rackspace, because EC2 at the time actually was kind of poor for a web workload. Their performance characteristics weren't great. And so I think what's happened, one of the big things, like a macro trend in that decade, is that public clouds have become, assumed, like there's still a ton of people that are in the process of migrating things around, but it's assumed that most people are building on a public cloud, and the public clouds have improved their services tremendously over the years to meet the needs of the kind of website workload. And so that is one big thing. So the building blocks are just much, much better than they used to be. And our service, and people have gotten more confident with that. There are, at the beginning, it was it was always a challenge to get someone to kind of release the control that they had when they were doing everything by hand and trust us as a platform to like make this because everybody knows the servers are actually still there. It's not serverless. But we make them go away as a concern. And so early on, people were like, oh, that's not possible. You can't do that. What if this? What if that? What if that? And so we had to build, both the industry had to get more comfortable with this broadly, and we had to build up our credibility. And then I think the other thing is, you started to see plenty of people that are not our customers, and maybe never will be, but validating and improving on this idea of applying these practices to this use case. So it's not like you have to use Pantheon to do web ops. Like you can totally set up your own. It's a fair amount of work, but there may be good reasons for you to do that. You might have something special in your use case, or you might need to be still in an on-prem environment, or you might have some integrations that require you to use a very particular set of tools in your stack. But the idea of, it's become less and less and less acceptable to think of the kind of cowboy coding approach to implementing web properties. We are also, added support pretty early on for WordPress. And there's an interesting distinction in terms of how people think of work, because one of the things that makes WordPress super awesome is like it has this plugin manager, and you can just go in there and click buttons and add functionality to your site. But under the hood, you're actually like installing new software on a running website. And so there's a set of people where that's tremendously valuable for the admin user to self-manage their own software. But that is kind of like a form of cowboy coding versus people who want to treat WordPress as a content management system kind of framework and do it the DevOps way and manage their releases and have version control and stuff like that. And it's just like, it's not saying one way is right and one way is wrong. It's just that, the kind of the DevOps, WebOps way is more appropriate to these larger scale, higher stakes use cases. And that's just become generally more accepted, and so now it feels like it's less of an uphill battle to convince people that they want to let go of their servers and they want to adopt these practices.
Yeah. So you've kind of come on this journey, which is a common journey in some respects, from a sort of agency consultancy. I'm sure you probably still do some of that as well, but to having this product with pricing plans and et cetera. But what is it? What would I be using Pantheon for in comparison to, I don't know, these days, Squarespace, WordPress.com, or Netlify, and the kind of different aspects of this content service platform we have now? Like what is Pantheon doing in that ecosystem?
Yeah. That's a great question. So the way to think about this is, for individuals implementing a website for themselves or for their small business or side hustle, the tools that are out there right now for them are frankly phenomenal compared to where we were like 10 years ago, or even going further back, right? Squarespace, Wix, WordPress.com, they are really great consumer grade tools that let a non-developer person, you only have to be like a tiny bit technical to be able to use them. And you can self-train the amount that you need if you have the time to invest in that and actually just run your own web presence. And where Pantheon comes in is when a larger organization, and it doesn't have to be a giant organization, it just needs to be an organization that has a specific brand and wants to have that expressed in a particular way, because you run into the limits of what you can do with a templating engine, right? So then you need to start to like own your own visual identity and brand. And that means kind of doing some amount of web development development. And as soon as there's like a need for web development, our platform potentially offers a ton of value because of all the workflow, the guardrails, et cetera. And as you start to think into even more ambitious cases where maybe this website's very successful and it needs to be able to have a lot of traffic or handle spiky traffic, like our platform provides a ton of value there. Or thinking even more broadly, where it's not just a website I'm thinking about, I'm thinking about my site portfolio. If I'm a larger company, a multinational organization, a chapter-based nonprofit, a university that has 5 schools and 500 departments, right? They don't have a website. They have a big site portfolio. And in the best case, what we can give those customers is kind of like their own version of Squarespace that they can manage internally, because you start with one of these really robust and mature open source content management systems. You sort of implement your flavor of that, make it into kind of a distribution model, and then we help you scale that out within a large organization, so that you, with the ability to still control and have that governance, have your cake and eat it too from a governance standpoint. It's a very unique way to get the value of open source. And
out of interest, like how much do you expose that open source to people who, don't care in that way? Like the kind of headless CMS we get now. We know there's developers can kind of do their thing, and content people can kind of do their thing, and they don't really care about the other parts. And how much are you exposing what you're using under the surface these days?
Yeah, so with the newest stuff that we've been launching, which is more competitive with, I want to be express proper respect towards like Netlify and Vercel. They have amazing products, and we're early entrants into that space. But yeah, we are competing with them for customers, particularly where there's a customer who wants that modern front end and a front end developer that doesn't want to have to worry about anything besides there's an API there. But the back end team wants to own it and actually have open source be the way they're delivering the headless content experience, because it's super frustrating when you use Contentful and they're like, oh, you want to model your content that way? Ka-ching! Or it's super frustrating if you're using a startup headless CMS that gets acquired or goes out of business, right? Like there's real reasons why you want to have ownership over the back end of a decoupled architecture. Yep. And we're able to give people, again, one platform that can manage both the front and the back. So we can make those projects way quicker to get up and running, way lower risk, lower cost to manage over time. We can give you support for both the front and the back end, like kind of one throat to choke, as they say. And you retain ownership over all your data, all your content model, and your front end team doesn't have to, to the extent that, they don't have to deal with, they're able to get what they want from a Jamstack development cycle perspective as well.
Oh, so to be honest with you, like I left the Drupal world some time ago, when this sort of headless CMS, or I think they were calling it something else then, was still in very early days of discussion. But now with, I'm assuming, fill me in here, with Drupal and WordPress, you can now do an equivalent as you can do with Jamstack, basically. And
yeah. So they've come a long way. I mean, we first started. I remember I did a meetup in San Francisco for headless Drupal in 2014, and it was like hot. It was like sizzling then. And
I think my time remembering it was before that.
Wow.
At least 2 or 3 years before that.
Yeah, you would meet people, because I met people in the Drupal community who were like, yeah, people headless, what are you talking about? I had Drupal powering an XML API that would drove a bunch of Flash front ends in 2007. Like I was there. It's not a totally new use case, but it was really starting to pick up then. But it was at that point like, okay, everyone can see there's the potential to do this, but there's not like best practices. There's not any support in Drupal core directly for doing this. It's just like, yes, anything is possible with open source. And since then, it really has developed into, there are convergent best practices for both Drupal and WordPress. And they kind of have different flavors, because Drupal, very database driven, structured data, like complex content modeling, reusable content. WordPress, the real sort of holy grail that people are actually building towards and getting close to is this idea of more of like an isomorphic experience, because they've decoupled their content editor experience effectively with Gutenberg. Like they shipped a completely, React based content editor on the back end. And the idea being like, well, these blocks, it doesn't quite just happen like that, but that people are getting that kind of like low code, no code content composition thing with WordPress's admin UI that then gets rendered as a modern front end. So it's super fast, super scalable, and can be highly interactive. And you can actually do both with both. Like WordPress has data modeling capabilities, and Drupal has like layout builder, which is drag and drop. It's just not as
that was its big,
suave.
powerful tool in those days, wasn't it? I mean, I don't know if it's still called the same, but in my day, it was called Views. I don't know if it's still the same thing.
Yeah, Views is like the thing you use to expose database. That's exposes the database, and now they have an in-core sort of like, okay, but what if I want to have a page that is some content here, view here, and then below it a different view, and you can kind of do a little composition thing. It's kind of like back in the day they had panels. That was a contrib module, and sort of a third generation successor to panels is now shipping in Drupal core, and you can make that work with a decoupled front end too. It's kind of cool.
Okay, so on this whole decoupled thing, when you refer to on your feature overview decoupled CMS, is that kind of what we're referring to? This sort of the language around this in the industry is really interesting because it's still evolving, and it also gets worse because everyone who's in the market is also trying to SEO various things that people are Googling, and then it's like the terms change. Anyway, the way to think about it, I think, is decoupled really refers to an architectural concept, right? It's when you take the pieces and you pull them apart. And then in that context, you'll have a CMS. Often people call it a headless CMS. We should probably call the page headless CMS or call it decoupled architecture if we were getting all of our words right. You have in a decoupled context, you have a headless CMS. Maybe you have other things too. There might be a little e-commerce endpoint. You might have some other microservices that are feeding things in. And then you've got your front end, basically. And so, and really for us, we've been sort of talking around this, in the context of decoupled CMS, because we're, 99% of our business today is for helping people getting the most out of their open source CMS. But the net new thing that we're launching is actually the front end component. So there's going to be another, we'll have some more collateral on the website about front end sites as the more and more as we get more and more into the market. Yeah. But the actual new cool thing is we'll run your front end too, and then we'll make it easy to connect those things. Yeah. Okay. And you have I think this is sort of a familiar-ish world to people. I sort of like the fact that Pantheon has been through this journey for some time. I can't quite remember when you started, but I almost feel like it's been a while. I feel like I remember seeing Pantheon when there was like 2 or 3 of you. So for some reason, I've got a bad feeling I'm going to really embarrass myself and mix you up with a different company, but I thought you were in France for some reason.
Oh no! So there is a different company. It's called Platform.sh.
That's it.
And they emerged like a couple years after us, but kind of some same ideas. They're awesome. Like they're a really great team.
That was it. Now I remember, Platform.
Damien and Uri and those folks, and now Bob and everybody.
Back to you. So there's a couple of other things you have here that sound interesting to me, which I think reflects the heritage, but I would be interested to know how you've evolved them over time.
Sure.
So one thing, although I think I saw in your blog that this might be deprecated soon, the local dev. Is that true? You're deprecating it soon anyway? So,
we are. What the local dev piece, we were like, and it was kind of an experiment to say like, can we build a GUI to make it easier for people to use this stuff around this open source local development environment management tool called Lando? And the honest answer is Lando is just grown by leaps and bounds, and local dev was struggling to keep up with it. Yeah. And most of the users were like, no, I'm actually fairly comfortable with a command line interface. I don't need this GUI. And Lando actually gives me a lot more power than local dev. Okay. So we have like a small number of users that are still on it and they love it, but it's a small number of users. And so, in order to focus our resources, we're going to sunset it so we can.
And how does that compare to something like containers, for example?
Yeah, so that's what Lando does. It's an amazing project. Lando is like a whole management framework for running containerized local development environments. And what they've done is they've worked with, and in some cases just copied what other vendors do. So depending on what platform or cloud you're using, you can kind of get a pre-built recipe to mimic it locally with Lando. And then they have tools for like pushing code and pulling content and data around that make it like as essentially just a lot simpler to manage that local development stuff. It's awesome.
Oh, I've not heard of it before. Okay. And then interestingly, this other one I noticed here, Quicksilver. What is that? You say web ops. I have a rough idea of what that might be, but tell me more. What's Quicksilver?
Yeah, so Quicksilver is a way of so what we provide out of the box is kind of like, here's some very standard things that every team we believe should have. Like, you should have a testing environment that's different from your development environment, that's different from your production environment. Yeah. And you should actually be able to do branch-based development so that you're not all sharing one development environment. Yeah. And you should have workflows for shuttling content around as well as deploying code. Because that's kind of the thing that makes the web as a use case tricky, is that you have to manage all this content in addition to managing the code. Yeah. That's what makes web ops kind of distinct from DevOps. But within any particular team or company or whatever, there are a lot of other things that are going to be a standard part of your workflow. So like every time we deploy to test, we need to kick off yada, 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 yada. And so Quicksilver is just this sort of open webhook system for whenever any of the workflow stages are engaged, you can just run a script. And then we have lots of like a whole big library of examples for people to just like plug and play for like Slack notifications, or trigger a Google Lighthouse test, or, sanitize all the data because there's sensitive stuff in there that developers shouldn't see, or what have you. But it's open-ended, so people can really develop whatever they need to automate more and more of their workflow. And the idea being like, we want to get the developer time pointed at higher value, things that are going to help the business grow and succeed in its mission, versus spending more time manually doing, data munging and stuff like that.
And with things like this, like Quicksilver, you've also mentioned, we haven't mentioned, but I can see on the feature list, deployment pipelines, integrated version control, multi-dev cloud environments, etc., and the CMS cores themselves. They're all sort of leaning on open source components. So I think the question from me, which probably don't want me to ask, but like how integrated is Pantheon with all those components if someone wanted to, on the version control flow, be able to do something more external or take things elsewhere, integrate with other pipelines that aren't in Pantheon, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So that there's kind of two questions in there. One is how much lock-in is there with Pantheon? Like, how proprietary are we? And the answer is, when it comes to the actual website itself, not at all, right? You can take your website and move it wherever you like. Like there is no vendor lock-in with Pantheon. When it comes to the workflow and the things that we provide out of the box, I mean, it's hard to replicate elsewhere. It's a lot of work to build a Pantheon. So if you want everything we offer, and you can DIY it, but it'll be a pretty extensive project. Yeah. But maybe people only need a subset of what we offer, and they can model that elsewhere. The second part of the question, though, was what about integration with other services, like other deployment pipelines, other version control?
So similar principles,
Yeah. And this is where we're like very open in this regard right now, and we're actually building more towards this. When we first started, circa 2012, GitHub was still in its early days, and we didn't feel like we could say like, hey, in order to use Pantheon, you have to use this other vendor over here. And so we built our own version control, repository management, blah, 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 into there. And that's like the backbone of how we do deploys, and it's been very valuable. However, over the past 10 years, it's now really clear that like our version control service is a little bit in the way of a lot of people's workflows. So more sophisticated customers kind of like they need to integrate with it. They don't want to use it directly. And I think that's just clearly the trend. So like, for instance, with our front end sites product, it does assume that you have a GitHub repository where you're managing your code. And that is going to be true of all of Pantheon in before too long. And then in terms of other deployment targets, part of our value is really being able to manage large scale and being able to really deliver the guarantee that, what worked in dev will work in test, will work in prod. We can't make those same guarantees around scalability or confidence in your releases if the deployment target is not us. But we don't prevent people from deploying elsewhere. And we have customers who will, there are some customers who will use our free sandbox system and really get a lot of value out of it because they sort of use it for free development work and deploy elsewhere. And that's okay. Like they're web developers. They're trying to build their presence, their business. And we also have some really sophisticated customers that will do like a dual deployment. They're like, yeah, okay, well, great. We deploy with Pantheon, but we also use their automation system every time we do a deploy to also kick off a separate process that pulls from the same repository and all that other stuff. And we keep a spare going on demand because for our business, it makes sense to invest in that extra cost to have a second, failover instance on a totally different provider. That's rare, but we do have people who do it.
Yeah. Okay. And so Pantheon has been in this business for a while. What's next for you? And what do you think is next for this ecosystem that you need to be on top of, or hopefully are? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, so the front end, the modern front end Jamstack JavaScript world is tremendously exciting, and I think it's exciting because the quality of end user experiences that can be built with that modern tool chain is just it's just better. It's inarguably better. It's like, it's not magically better because like you can still build a janky website, right? But if you do it well, like you can deliver, particularly like more and more web traffic is mobile, like the uncanny valley between app and site is just getting more and more blurred. And that a lot of that is being driven by those modern JavaScript front ends. I think that's a huge thing for us. We're just putting our first foot into that pool now, and we're going to continue wading into it over the next several years. That's going to be really exciting. The other thing, and I think that's going to be like what that means for the traditional open source CMSs is also really interesting. Like regular CMS is not going away anytime soon because doing a decoupled thing, it is more complicated. It's not for everyone.
And it's also in enterprise, there's a lot of these enterprise level CMS that many people have even heard of that still sew up a lot of work.
Yeah. That's like, don't even get me started on like all of the behemoths that are just lumbering along. But the other thing I think is really exciting for our industry, and it's going to be an interesting question for the open source community, but also just the web and digital marketing at large is I would say we're in the early stages of a massive sea change in how people gather and utilize data and how people monetize and deliver value through the web. The device privacy is going up, browsers privacy is going up, regulatory restrictions on what you can and do with data legally are becoming tighter and tighter, and the models that have built out the whole MarTech and AdTech and social media ecosystems that have really kind of they were the real driving forces of the web over the last decade. Those are all going to get churned over because if you can't do if your ad tech and martech can't use third-party cookies, like so many of those businesses just completely unravel. And if social media platforms can't micro-target customers as well, they can't support their ad revenues, and that's going to just change an awful lot of things. And it's going to be probably painful for some folks, but I think it's going to spur a lot of innovation for the web more broadly. I'm actually kind of bullish on this as a way for, I think the real web 3.0 is not anything to do with cryptocurrency. Right. I think it has to do with like a web where more people are like take ownership of their data and are able to build more interesting and interconnected things. So
it's a good point, but I sort of wonder, as a business, how do you think you can I don't know if capitalize is the right word, but provide the tools that people might need, I think, is a better way of
Yeah.
putting it.
So I think for us, it's a totally fair question, right? Like you don't like there are, what's your strategy for thriving in a changing marketplace? And so I think there's one assumption I make, which I may be wrong about, but is that like our fundamental value today is still going to be valuable, in the years to come, because it's not like websites are going away. If anything, they're just becoming more important, right? Because the owned channel, you can't rely on social media. If you can't rely on social media to micro-target your customers and you're just doing more broad-based stuff, how do you attract the right audience? Well, you have to create more compelling content that audience cares about. That's how you're going to get the right people, is by you giving them an experience that's going to matter to them. So I think that the importance of tools to really deliver great customer experiences, which is the core of what we do, those are not going to go away anytime soon. And then I think there are so many companies and nonprofit organizations and educational institutions that are just realizing that they have to come up with a strong first-party data strategy that does it ethically, legally, securely, but where they earn the right to some amount of information about their audience, because the truth is, people do, when it's done right, people do prefer something that's tailored to them, right? Like nobody wants to like creepy surveillance, but also everyone in surveys is like, yeah, I prefer a personalized experience, of course, right? And so I think, and the way to strike that balance properly between a business and their visitors, their prospects, their customers, their fans, their followers, whatever. Right now, like so many folks have just outsourced that to these third-party providers, and that's just not going to be the way of the future. And so I think there's an opportunity for us as a platform, because we have the whole thing of the actually delivered web experience as a thing we help people succeed with. We own the user experience from the edge CDN down to like the database and the file system. We can help them, gather first-party data in the appropriate way, and then make use of it in ways that are also not just ethical, but also effective. That's a bit more heady. Like I don't have a product for that now, but this is where we're doing some research.
It's a challenge, and so you don't go into the same trap you've just said of becoming the owner of all that. Giving it's an overused word, but empowering people without taking the power away, I suppose.
Yeah. The model has to be, we help the customers own it for themselves, not we own it for them.
Yeah.
And that's tricky. I don't think anyone's really proven that yet, but like all the technology is there to do that. Yeah. It's just a question of whether you can make it easy enough, because the problem is not the technology. It's actually just that it's super complicated and difficult. So it has to be like productized to a point where the customers can really take ownership over it and do the right things. And, that's going to take years for us to develop, but it's, we'll have years of this industry unraveling. So
So very, very finally, because I think we touched on it briefly, but like cold, hard facts, what's on the roadmap for the next 6 months that you can talk about and want to talk about?
Yeah. For the next 6 months. So we have a bunch of stuff. There's like we are in market now with our front end sites capability, but there's a whole roadmap for that. There's a lot of, we're going to be releasing on that product line throughout the year and into next year for sure. So we have starter kits for WordPress and Drupal. We have support for Next.js and Gatsby, but there are other frameworks. There are things that we want to be able to do to make like multi-environment stuff work. Like what if you want 2 front ends for 1 back end? Lots of things like that are going to be rolling out over the course of the year. We have some improvements to our support for WordPress, particularly for their multi-site networks capability. So where you can have like, it's one instance of WordPress, but like with many different faces. So like if you're a university and you want to give every professor their own blog, that sort of thing.
Regions and things like that. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. And then we have some stuff that's like more for the IT audience, right? So we have some work coming out around log forwarding, people who want to be able to run like scheduled data import, data export, those sorts of capabilities, like being able to do more of that natively within our platform versus them having to like, because again, we're saying, hey, we're going to give you this web ops infrastructure. And they're like, yeah, but if I still have to own all, like how much are you actually taking on versus how much do I have to keep running? Yeah. So some stuff for that audience. yeah, in the next 6 months, I'd say those are kind of some of the big themes that are going to come through. And then I'm hoping later in the end of the year, we'll start to see some other stuff, come online. We just finished releasing finally to the last of the customers a next generation dashboard for our own product user experience. So there's like just a ton of usability improvements that are going to come along with that, but some cool things maybe around like data and analytics. But I can't promise that for the next 6 months.
It sounded like there was a lot anyway, so I think you're good. But yeah. Okay, well, Josh, thank you very much for joining me.
Hey, Chris, thanks so much for the conversation. It was great.
That was my interview with Josh Koenig from Pantheon. I have a few things to share with you. On the YouTube, I've kind of given up on Twitch, to be honest with you. I wasn't really getting anywhere with it. I'm now just focusing purely on YouTube. So in the past week, on Monday, I looked at mixing documentation and React with Mintlify. I also looked very, very briefly at Motive, but couldn't get it to work. So mostly Mintlify. That was okay. And then on Wednesday, I looked at Diffusion B and Amazing AI. These are both macOS desktop-esque tools for using Stable Diffusion and seeing where I could get with those. Tomorrow, Friday, I will be doing a second installment of Joe Deva's Lone Wolf Flight from the Dark live play. And I think next week I will be spending a bit of time looking at NixOS related tools. And Wednesday I haven't quite decided. I'm trying to make Wednesday more of the creative day. We'll see. And I finished the Storytelling Collective Flash Fiction competition. I have a few gaps, but you could go and read all of my content there now. So that's mostly what I've been getting through on Medium. And I am also very pleased to say that my new website is pretty much live at christianchiller.com using Astro. And that's a blog I need to fill in about how I actually did it. There's definitely some things missing, but a lot of the fundamentals are there. My events with some gaps, my podcast feed is there now, my video feed, most of my blog, writing, games and client work. There's a lot of other things I'm yet to add in, but you can find a lot of it there now. So that's good. Very pleased that it's finally up, even if it's not finished per se. All right, then. I will be back next week with another interview and or roundup of links. And until then, thank you very much for joining me and take care, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the show. Find out more about me at christianchiller.com, where you can find show notes, sign up for my newsletter, and find all of my writing, games, work, and video links. There's also details on how to get in touch with me. And if you want to get even closer to what I do, join my Discord server for behind-the-scenes discussions and helping me produce my shows and work.